Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Peyton Bentley and I work for Kaplan Professional. And we are a provider of licensing, exam prep, and continuing education material for individuals and businesses in a variety of fields, including financial planning, real estate, insurance, licensing, and accounting. And we offer online courses, printed material, ebooks, and in-person classes for our students. And we've been using DITA now since 2014, so I'm just going to talk to you about how we implemented it and what the benefits and the challenges are. So I like to start out with a little bit of a glossary. So HTML versus XML. HTML, of course, is where you tag content for presentation or display. So like bold, italic, centered, left aligned, whatever. So you don't really know what the content is, you just know what it looks like. But XML, on the other hand, lets you actually tag for semantics or what the content is. So in my example here, I have cite, DITA for dummies, versus just italic DITA for dummies. Well, obviously with the XML, with the cite, I know that that's a citation, so I can do something with that later. Whereas with the italic, I have no idea what that content is, and it's always going to look italic on the output. Secondly here, DITA XML. DITA stands for Darwin Information Typing Architecture. It uses specialization and inheritance for elements. So it's called Darwin because it's sort of like Darwin's theory of evolution, where elements are inherit features from their parents. And it's open source and it's topic based. So that means each file is just about one topic or concept. So they're much smaller files and you can move those around pretty easily. And then lastly here, transforms. And a transform is just a script that changes content from one type of code into another. So for example, DITA to InDesign. Or you can do DITA to Word, Word to DITA, DITA to other types of XML, whatever. So why did we go with XML? When we started the discussion about changing from XML, it was because we needed a way to make our content available to different types of deliverables quickly. So our old workflow was that we would have a writer write in a Word document, they would send that over to copy edit, it would go back and forth a few times. Once it was approved, it would get sent to layout. Once it was done in layout, it would get exported again as Word. It would go back to the authors and they would mark up what they wanted the online material to look like. And then it would basically get copied and pasted into our LMS page by page by page. So you can imagine the time between the printed material and the online course was pretty long and very manual and a lot of room for errors. So with XML, we could rearrange our files quickly for whatever delivery needs that we needed to do. Second, technology updates. A couple times since I've been at Kaplan, we've had new LMS, like a new LMS come in, and so every time that happened, the content had to be checked very carefully. So they could export as a database the content on the old LMS to the new one, but things often didn't come out very well because it's all HTML. It was a lot of work and it took a lot of time to get this material cleaned up for the new LMS. But if we have XML, we could very easily just make a new transform to get it into whatever language the new LMS would need. And then lastly here, we needed a way to make our content more configurable. So creating content is expensive and takes a long time. So it makes some sense to reuse what you already have created. And so with XML, we can filter content depending on the product and create new courses really quickly. So why DITA in particular? Well, other business units were already trying it. So our parent company is Kaplan Inc., and one of our sister companies is Kaplan Test Prep. So they're the ones that do like SAT, GRE. Well, those two were already looking into DITA. So the theory was that eventually we might all be able to work together and share our content. That didn't really work. The other two stopped using DITA, but we're still going strong. I'm not really sure why they stopped. It just didn't really work out for their workflows. But for us, it's easily adaptable for new elements, metadata, and attributes. So if we needed certain metadata or new element for our content, it's really easy to create. And then learning and training specialization supports questions and learning objectives. So because we're a learning company, we have a lot of questions and we need to create learning objectives, and that's part of our Kaplan way for learning, to make sure that these are the things you're going to learn in this course, here are questions that support that. And DITA has that already built in, so it worked really well. But how did we decide on it? So we did a pilot. This was in 2013. We chose 3 product lines. I think at this point we have maybe 24 product lines. So we chose 3 that we thought were representative of everything else. We called in a DITA consultant to help us. She taught us about DITA, taught us the ways that we might use it, workflows around it, setting up our teams and that sort of thing. And we determined any needed metadata for our LMS. So, for example, for our questions, we needed a way to put in how many points a question is worth. So we created an element called point value that lets you put in, this is worth 1 point or it's worth 5 points. And we can pass that information to our LMS to keep track of it. And then that leads into the next one here. We learned to specialize DITA DTDs. And so that's basically where you set up what elements and attributes are allowed in your files. So for example here, in our real estate product line, we have a lot of court cases that we cite. And so we could have just used cite, but I thought, we might at some point want to be able to pull together a list of all the court cases, sort of like a list of figures in the back of the book. So if we tag them all as legal cite, we could harvest that material later. So that's one that we created. And we started developing transforms. And so for tools, we started using Oxygen XML Editor, and that's a tool for power users so they can go in and edit the code. We have transforms, LMS, PDF, and now Typefi, which we've been using Typefi for about 1.5 years, I think. Before that, we had DITA to ink-copy transform, but it wasn't very good. And so there was still a lot of work involved in layout. So we're using Typefi, and that's really helping as we get more into it. And we're working on getting an authoring tool so that our authors will actually be able to edit the DITA themselves, but it'll just look like Word. So they don't have to know any of the code, so they can go in, make the edits, and then it'll go to our copy edit team. Whereas right now we have the edits come in, well, here at the bottom of the process, edits come in via PDF, and our production team will make those edits in the DITA files, and then update the deliverables and send them out to be checked. But hopefully with the authoring tool, we'll be able to avoid some of this back and forth with the edits coming in via PDF. And then training. So we had that consultant, and she trained the trainers. And since then, we've also developed our own in-house training that's specific for our DITA schema and the exact ways that we're using all the different elements. So the big question, how did people deal with it? Well, when we rolled it out, we had a lot of informational sessions. So just trying to get everybody in the company on board with what DITA means, what it is, what are the benefits, and how it was going to be able to help our authors and help us get more content out quicker. And we also tried to include stakeholders in decisions. And when we originally started, we had, it was like a DITA advisory board, and those people were supposed to help us make decisions, but that didn't really work out very well, so that kind of went away. It was just too many cooks in the kitchen. How was it received? People were really nervous. They didn't know what it meant. It was just something brand new from our old process. They were unhappy with the process time because although it really cut the time between our print and online material, overall the process was a little bit slower, and that's for converting. But once the content is in DITA and already converted, it speeds up the process time greatly for further additions. But people are actually finally coming around now, and we had a meeting a couple weeks ago where our content authors were basically told, listen, you're going into DITA. And people were okay about it, so I felt really good about that meeting and like, maybe this is going to go a little bit farther. What are the challenges? Our subject matter experts really struggle with knowing where their content is used, and this causes issues for reuse. So we can take a topic that's in one of our national real estate courses and use it in a state-specific course. If when they're reviewing that state-specific course, they want to edit that topic and they don't realize that it's from the national course, that can really cause problems later. So that's something that we're working on, is really helping people understand that if they make a change in one place, it could affect other outputs. Secondly, determining at what point content should be updated versus reconverted. So that's something that we're working on. If a unit has got a lot of changes, maybe it makes more sense to reconvert it than to just update all those changes. DITA XML is complicated, and people that work in it need to be able to understand how to style content for what it is rather than how it should look. That's been a challenge because the people that we have working in this used to work in HTML, and getting them to understand what the content is, that's been hard. And it takes effort to determine deliverable needs and get transforms to perform correctly. Getting the transforms right really is an iterative process. And when you start and make a transform, that's great, but then if you get a year into it and there's a new kind of course that has a new kind of need, you might have to go back and update the transform to get it to work correctly for this new thing. But even though there are all those challenges, there are a lot of benefits. Reuse is the big one. We can take a topic, reuse it across a lot of different products. You can reuse just a paragraph, you can reuse a list, you can reuse a whole unit, you can reuse a map. You can move it anywhere that you want and create a new deliverable. You can set up different paragraphs in a topic that are tagged. So if we needed to use this topic in a national course and a Georgia course, but it needed one paragraph, let's say, needed to be different for Georgia than for the national, you can tag that paragraph as this is for Georgia only and this is for national only. And then when you run the transform, you can say exclude anything that's for Georgia or include only the national thing. So you can really set it up to do whatever you want. Structured content is more consistent content. So if you have, let's say, 12 books, and in one book, a citation needs to be underlined, in another book it needs to be italics, in another it needs to be bold, that gets to be a lot to remember. But if you know that you just need to tag it as cite, that's much easier. And then it's on the transform for whichever transform you use, the transform will say, okay, cite needs to become underlined for this, or it needs to be italic for this one, or bold for this one. And then if you need a new deliverable type, all you have to do is get a new transform. So now that we've been in this for 4 years, my advice is know why you want to move to DITA. Is it for ease of transformation or is it for reuse? So that answer will help you plan ahead and prepare for the future. Ensure that you have adequate support from management and that they understand the benefits and challenges associated with the conversion. Because you're really going to need management support to make sure everyone gets on board with this. Sort of like the first one, think about what your end goal is, and that will help you plan for the future. I mean, we're now coming up with things that we think, oh, we really should have built this way, or we should have done this way, but we have a lot of our content already in DITA, so if we want to change the process or change the way we're doing something, we're going to have to go all the way back and fix everything that we've already got finished. I would say plan for a lot of troubleshooting in QA, probably more troubleshooting in QA than you think there might be, at least until everyone gets really acquainted with the conversions and the transforms. I would say have a list of what you need to convert and in what order. That's really hung us up, is try to decide what product line needs to go in next. And if you have a list up front, then that would really help speed things along. And lastly, DITA is not a miracle drug, so adjust your expectations accordingly. It'll work, but it's not going to solve every problem.
Thanks, Peyton. Now for part 2 of this presentation. I'm Eric Damitz. I'm a senior solutions consultant with Typefi, and we were brought in, our Kaplan invited us into their world about 1.5 years ago, maybe a little more than that, to kind of include Typefi in the workflow. So They've done all this work, they have all of this DITA, now you still need to print a book. So Typefi is a way you can do that. This is a little bit of advice on how to do that sort of project. So to include us in a project like this, it's really important that you have the right team to work with us so we can work together. And the DITA expert, of course, is critical. You need that person who understands the code, because we're coming in, we work with all kinds of XML from all kinds of people. We need to know about yours and how you use it. If you're going to print or any other output like that, we need the publication expert. So who knows the design? What is it supposed to look like? How is it supposed to work? Because what our task is to take that DITA XML, transform it into the design you want. So we have to understand both halves of that. And it's very important that there's one or more decision makers involved. They don't have to be day-to-day, but if we need to go back and say, hey, if you add this attribute to the DITA, it makes the design easier to do. If somebody can say, okay, sure, sounds good, and make it happen, then we can get the project kind of moving faster. So to start that process of how do we take all this XML and turn it into the product that you're selling, we kind of need, we can't do everything at once. It has to be, like Peyton said, an iterative process. We're going to start with a good sample publication or publications. What are the common content types? You don't want to try to think of every possible thing you ever do and then try to put that into one sample. Just what are the most common things that you do? Choose a current design, so don't pick something that you did 25 years ago because it does contain all that stuff, but it doesn't look like what you do now. And then current DITA. So if you're you're also iterating how you're using that code, use a more current one so we're not building a transform to something that doesn't work that way anymore. And again, you shouldn't, and it's impossible to include everything that you will ever do from now until the end of time. So kind of scope it so that it's something we can do successfully and then continue adding to it as time goes on. What I found that was really great about working with Kaplan is it was very collaborative. Like there was we didn't meet every 2 weeks and have a half-hour conversation, and that's the only time we talked. I pretty much spam these guys with questions as we're developing something, and I always get a really fast response because we're working together on making this work. So a lot of things that are happening, I'll be working with our engineers on the transform, and they'll say, if it was this way, is this possible? Because the transform would be a lot more efficient if, you know. So I would just ask, can we do this? And most of the time the answer is sure, yeah, no problem. Same thing with the InDesign template. Maybe change a paragraph style name because the transform is already doing something. And sure, there's a lot of flexibility there. And then also on our side, I have a set way that I think some things might need to work, but then you kind of turn that and say, well, I could do it a different way because that will accommodate the need better. So everybody's kind of flexible and collaborative, and that's a really great way to work. Definitely document everything. So every time we do make a change like that, it's very important for you, the customer, to keep track of these things. So if we add a new attribute, somebody needs to know about that so the next time that book is done, they know why it's there or they know they have to add that. And you can have us do that for you, but I personally am very lazy and I hate writing documentation, so it's better if you do it yourself because you already have your own internal scheme for doing that. And it's all these kinds of things, the markup, the design specs, the workflow itself, and then of course any workarounds that you discover or that we kind of implement as the process is going. So kind of generally, for the long-term view of a project like this, don't try to get one sample that'll work. Think of it as more in chunks. The development will be iterative, but our goal is to continuously improve the solution. So we're adding things to make it work better. We're making it run faster. We're making it more efficient. We're just fixing all the little things that need to be fixed to make the end result what you wanted. This is a little bit from the technical standpoint, like how does it actually work? The DITA files are stored in a folder structure, and there's lots of files. There's hundreds and hundreds of files in all of these folders that make up one book. So the first thing we do is we have a transform that combines them all into one gigantic XML file. So it's resolving all the links to the different files. It's resolving the references to text in other files, and putting it all together. There's a second transform that converts that to CXML, and if you don't know what CXML is, it's the format that we convert any kind of XML to in order to run it to InDesign. And we can transform CXML to other formats after that, or we could also do DITA to HTML or something like that. But that second transform makes the CXML. We also realized we needed a third one to fix some white space issues and have the correct lift for quotes and things. What we learned was that in Oxygen, there's this nice feature called Format and Indent. And if you're looking at code, if you push that button, it makes the tags look nice. But if you don't set it up quite right, it also adds spaces and hard line breaks in all of your text. And a lot of the files were like that. Rather than going and making them clean all that up, we just added another transform that kind of fixes that sort of thing. And then we did add another transform for a particular group of publications that it just needed an icon after the A heads. So rather than pasting that in or adding it to the DITA, let's just do a transform that adds that element where it's needed. The most important thing, though, is that all of the InDesign templates for all of the different designs, they all have the same Typefi section element and field names, and then all the paragraph and character styles are the same. So they're different designs. They look completely different. But all of the components that make up the design are named the same way. So there's one transform that can do any book, and you can take any content and run it through any template to get the output you want. So it's very flexible. So here's like a little survey of some of the cool stuff that happens. As Peyton said, all the questions are separate files, and they each contain the question, the answer, and then there's rationale text, so why is the correct answer. Within the DITA file, there are attributes and even the location of the question reference. That indicates how the text should be displayed in the output. The questions can appear within a chapter or at the end of the book. So the same question file can be referenced in multiple places, and depending on where it's placed, it looks different. The same thing with the answers. They can be at the end of a chapter, they can be all collected at the end of the book, they may or may not have the rationale text. Well, this is all coming from the same source file. So within other parts of the DITA, it says, well, in this book we don't want the rationales, in this book we do. So the transform has to be set up to deal with all of those situations. So here's just a page. This is a module quiz. And this comes, so there's multiple ones of these in each unit. So is it unit or chapter? A reading? It's a reading. Okay. So the chunk is a reading, and there are multiple groups of these. So that's like an A head that has text and information, and then there's some little questions at the end of it. So if those questions appear here, that's the design for those. If that same question appeared at the end of a chapter in another template, it would have a completely different look. So this is the DITA for that. It's the question at the top there. There's all the multiple choice answers, and one of them has a correct response tag in it. And then below that is the rationale. So there's no A, B, or C here. It's just three things in a particular order. So if we go back to here, there was no 1, 2, or 3 in there either. So this is a combination of things. The transform is putting it in that paragraph style, but the InDesign template, that's a numbered list style. So that's where the numbering is coming from. There's no ABC in the transform or in the DITA, so that's the paragraph style doing that. When we see the answer key, this is coming at the end of that reading. We see those numbers again. None of that's in the DITA. That's a paragraph style. That A, B, and C, that's not auto numbering. It has to know which one is the correct answer and which letter to put there. So the transform is figuring out what position that correct answer tag is in, and it's translating that into a letter and putting that into the CXML. And then if it happens to be one that you want the rationale as well, it'll also insert a tab and then copy the rationale text in there. So there's a lot of logic going on to make this type of thing here. And at the very end there's that LOS37.A. That is a reference back to one of the learning objectives, and that lives in that feedback or that rationale text. And that's that long kind of brown text there. That's a reference to another file. And that other file contains the number and the text for that learning objective. But the transform knows this is an answer key, so I just want that number, but I also want parentheses around it. So think of all of the thought that the team here had to put into explaining how all of this needs to work. And then us translating that so our engineers could write the transform to make that happen, and then setting up the template to make it all kind of work together. So that's what I mean. The collaboration is so critical here because I don't know what any of that means. You do. You tell me, and then we can tell our engineers who don't know what any of this means how it's all supposed to work. So it all works out in the end. With the DITA, the content references is like one of the strengths of it. So it's lots of reusable content from a phrase all the way to an entire topic. Again, about the learning objective numbers and text can be placed wherever they need to be. They do cross-referencing to other titles that other people publish. So there's a list of those in a file, and then you just grab those from that list. And if those change, you can update that one file, and the next time you run a job, those are all updated. And then Peyton also mentioned the conditional content. So you can say this is for one particular audience, this is for a different one. And we use our apply conditions action in Typefi to turn on and off those conditions to output what you want. So here's another example of a learning objective, and this is the same one we were looking at before. But in this case, it's showing up with the full text, and it's blue, and there's no parentheses, and there's a colon. And then there's a reference below that to a particular book, volume, and page number from another series of books. So all of that information is in the DITA as just cross-references to other files. And the files contain content, but you're pulling out pieces of the content and placing it in different locations on that output page. So this is a very powerful way to reuse things. And it's, again, it's a lot of collaboration to understand all this logic and how all of this is supposed to work out. There's a little bit of math in Kaplan content. We're using the Math Tools plugin by Movement. Because it sets the math in live editable text, it's possible to do some things to help the typesetting along. The specs themselves are just paragraph and character style, so the size and the spacing and all of that sort of thing is controlled in InDesign, along with what are called math styles via the Movement plugin. So you can specify certain types of figures in math can be adjusted to look the way you want them to. We also built a suite of scripts to adjust spacing around stacked equations or tall equations, and to fix the lighting within paragraphs where there's a taller equation. And also, we use paragraph borders and shading to give the effect of a box. So if you're adjusting the spacing around an equation, that will leave a gap in the shading, so that also has to be adjusted. And then this is one we're kind of starting to go down the path of talking about maybe doing is, depending on how the MathML is set up, we can do alignment on equal signs and stacking equations and things like that. That's a more to come kind of a thing. And we're using our apply grep script to insert some discretionary breakpoints. So if an equation is long and you want it to break before the plus sign versus after the plus sign, you have to tell it where those breaks are allowed. And that can be customized for whatever your style is for handling equations like that. And then you can also use a grep script or character style updates to fix mixing glyphs. So if you're using a font that doesn't contain every single math glyph, you can swap in some of them with a different font that does. And so there's a few ways to do that. So here's just a little example of like a formula sheet at the end of something. And this is all MathML being converted into these stacked equations in Math Tools in InDesign. And it's, MathML. And then in Oxygen, you see it kind of renders them like that. But then in InDesign, we have to add some extra spacing around those so they fit right. So there's a lot of adjustments being made by scripts. And then there's a few other little things, different logos for different product lines, different copyright text. So there's an attribute in the DITA that says, I'm this kind of product. So when you run the job, there's a script that reads that as a Typefi field, and it turns on the correct layer so you get the right logo or the right copyright text. There's thumb tabs in some of the books, and they progress down the side of the page as each reading progresses. So the script figures out what number that reading is in relation to the other ones, and it moves it down the page on those InDesign pages. Sometimes if you want to show a multiple page PDF, like a contract or something, or an example of that, you just load the one PDF in, and it'll place each page of that as a multi-part figure. And this is kind of a fun one, the table sizer. If you run a table into InDesign, it'll just be whatever width the text frame is. But those are all there might be too much space in them, so they're wider than they need to be. So Peter Carell, our script genius, he came up with a way to figure out how to kind of pull the air out of these tables so they're not so huge, but without causing overset or weird line breaks or anything. So that's, one of those things that I think it's working okay, right? But, it may not work on a table. So this is, again, where that communication and collaboration comes in. I will get a notification this one didn't work, so Peter will go back and kind of improve the script. Blattnerized tables, that's a link, so I won't go into exactly what that means, but it's a way of putting continuation text on multi-page tables. And it's a trick from InDesign Secrets, which is a website any InDesign user should be familiar with. And then we do have a prepare for EPUB script where you can take the InDesign files that you've run through Typefi, and you might have made changes to them, pagination changes or corrections. Rather than going back to the DITA to make the EPUB, you can just take those InDesign files you already have, and the script prepares them to export an EPUB, and then it puts it through the typical EPUB process to get those produced. So that would be the end of the prepared remarks. If you want to come on up. Does anybody have any questions for either Peyton or me?
I have a question for Peyton. If you could go back to 2003 and give yourself a set of notes, what would be in there?
If I was going back to the pilot, I mean, I was only one member of the team, but I was the person from editing who understood sort of what the content really is. I think I would have been a lot pushier about setting things up differently. I mean, now we're starting to go back and clean up some things. I think I also would have been thinking more in the future about different kinds of reuse and how we set up those references, like for that, like for the CFA one, where it just says like LOS, whatever. So now this past season, we've added modules in there, and so those were going right to the LOS file. So if the LOS number changes, then you would just change it there, and they would update everywhere. Well, I think, and what we started to do for other product lines is set up a page of references, so it's like the study session, the reading, the module. So all of those are put together. So we do reference 1, reference 2, reference 3, and reference 4, rather than trying to hard code anything, because then if that changes, if the LOS number changes, it's going to automatically change in our list that says the study session number is this. This is the reading number. And so it's a lot more content referencing, but it's still change it in one place and it's fixed everywhere. So I think thinking about things like that more, that I didn't really know we would be using it like this. So, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how much staff time it took to actually get the decisions made and get this moving? Was this, one person for 2 months, or was this 17 people for 6 years? Or what kind of investment did this take in terms of time?
So there were, I think, 5 of us on the pilot team, and we had the consultant. And the pilot took about maybe 6 months. And that was with us trying to get all the transforms set up. I mean, we really, because the other companies were already using DITA, I don't think it was a pilot in as much as like, hey, let's see if this is going to work for us. It was basically figure out how this is going to work for you. So in that 6 months, we had to learn how to code things, what our transforms needed to look like. And so that required a lot of working with like our LMS to determine what code they needed. So it was a lot of those things. Actually figuring out the DITA code, that was kind of the easiest part of it. But it was setting it up so that we could actually do something with that code. That's what took so long. And I mean, and even still after that 6 months, it's still really, like I frequently get for the LMS. So I can do some of the transform updates myself, some of the smaller ones, not with Typefi, but for some of our other things. And so it'll be like, okay, a long quote doesn't work if it doesn't have a paragraph tag in it. Can you make that work if it doesn't have one? If it's just one paragraph, it doesn't indent. Can you fix that? So there are still things like that that I'm fixing now, because if we've never seen it before, we don't know that it doesn't work. Yeah, and so,
So 5 of you for 6 months, is that all you were doing, or were you trying to do your regular job?
regular work too.
Okay.
Yeah,
So you were juggling.
yeah. And so I was still on editing at that point, and then when we finished the pilot, that's when I applied for the information architect job because I really like to problem solve and figure out how to make things work, and so that's a really good fit for me. But yeah, and so then though, to convert the content, that's of course a much larger situation. But we still have a really small team that we're trying to grow. I think right now on our production DITA team, there's maybe 6 people, and we have a lot of content, so that's why it's taken us so long to get everything through.
This one's for Eric.
What?
I can't help thinking it might be nice later on today to see those math scripts in action, or maybe even learn a bit more about the EPUB scripts that you developed with Kaplan.
Oh, that might be interesting, yeah. Maybe we could do something about that.